My son-in-law thought he had won. He thought that by the time he found out what I had done, it would be too late for me to fight back. What he did not know was that I had been 3 steps ahead of him for over a year. My name is Walter Merritt. I am 67 years old. And this is the story of how I watched my own daughter become a stranger. How I almost lost everything I spent 40 years building, and how one quiet Tuesday morning I took it all back. I want to start by telling you about the man I used to be. I worked construction for 32 years. Not the kind where you sit in an office and look at blueprints. The kind where you are on the ground at 5 in the morning when it is still dark and your knuckles are cracked from the cold and you do not go home until the job is done. I started as a laborer when I was 19 years old, carrying materials, mixing concrete, doing whatever anyone told me to do. By the time I was 35, I had my own crew. By the time I was 45, I had my own company, Merritt Construction, 12 employees, residential and light commercial work across 3 counties in central Ohio. My wife, Patricia, died of ovarian cancer when our daughter Renee was 22. That was 11 years before any of this happened. Patricia was 54 years old. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, who kept a garden in the backyard, even when her knees were bad, who made sure our daughter knew she was loved every single day. When she died, I did not know how to be both parents at once. I tried. I do not know if I succeeded. Renee was our only child. After Patricia passed, I poured everything I had into making sure Renee was okay. I helped her finish her last year of college. I helped her move into her first apartment. When she called me crying at midnight because a relationship fell apart, I drove 40 minutes to sit with her. I was not a perfect father, but I showed up. That is the one thing I know for certain. I always showed up. She met my son-in-law at a work event when she was 28. His name was Derek. He was 33. Well-dressed. Confident in the way that some men are confident, not because they have earned anything, but because no one has ever told them no. He had a sales job at a medical equipment company. Made decent money. Drove a nice truck. The first time I met him, he shook my hand too hard and talked about himself for 40 minutes without asking me a single question. I noticed that Patricia always said I was too suspicious of people, that I looked for the bad before I looked for the good. Maybe she was right, but I noticed Renee loved him. That was what mattered to me. She was happy in a way I had not seen since before her mother got sick. She laughed differently around him. Her whole face changed. I told myself that my instincts were wrong, that I was just a father who did not want to give his daughter to anyone, that Derek was a good man, and I needed to give him a real chance. They got married 2 years later at a venue outside Columbus. I paid for the wedding. $60,000. I wrote the check because Renee asked me to, and because Patricia was not there to walk her down the aisle, and I wanted that day to be everything she had ever imagined. Derek's parents contributed $4,000 and a card. I did not say anything about that. The first year of their marriage was fine. They rented a house. Renee kept her job as a dental hygienist. Derek kept his sales job. They seemed normal. Bosu. I saw them most Sundays for dinner. Derek was never warm toward me, but he was not hostile. He was just there, checking his phone, answering in short sentences, eating the food I cooked and leaving without helping clean up. Renee always apologized for him quietly. In the kitchen, after he walked out to start the truck, I told her it was fine. I told myself it was fine. Then they had my grandson. Oliver was born 3 years into their marriage. 8 pounds, 4 ounces, thick, dark hair, eyes that stayed alert from the first day in a way that made the nurses laugh. I was in the waiting room for 11 hours. When the nurse finally came out and said I could go in, I walked through that door, and Renee looked up at me from the bed holding this small red-faced boy. and I sat down next to her and she placed Oliver in my arms. And I did not say a single word for a long time. I just held him. I thought about Patricia. I thought about how much she would have loved this moment. I thought about how the whole point of a life is to make something that outlasts you. I was a good grandfather. I kept Oliver every Friday. I drove him to his pediatric appointments when Renee had work. I built him a wooden play set in my backyard. Every board measured and sanded by hand. Oliver called me Pop. He still calls me Pop. About 8 months after Oliver was born, Derek lost his job. The medical equipment company restructured, and his entire division was cut. He told me this at Sunday dinner in a tone that suggested it was the company's fault and not something he had any control over. I asked if he had prospects. He shrugged and said the market was tight. Renee looked at the table. He was out of work for 4 months. During that time, I noticed things. Derek was home all day, but the house was never clean. Renee came home from 8-hour shifts and cooked dinner and put Oliver to bed and then sat with a glass of wine looking at nothing. Derek had a new fishing setup that cost several $100s. I saw it in the garage when I came to pick up Oliver one Saturday. I did not say anything. When Derek got a new job, lower salary, longer hours, I thought the tension would ease. It did not. If anything, he became more difficult, irritable, impatient with Oliver in ways that made my stomach tighten. Not violent. Nothing I could point to and say that is the line. Just a coldness. A disinterest. The kind of fathering that is really just physical presence, without any of the substance. Then came the conversation that changed everything. Renee called me on a Wednesday evening. Oliver was 18 months old. She told me in a voice that was trying to sound casual that she and Derek had been looking at houses they wanted to buy instead of rent. The market was difficult, she said. They had not saved as much as they hoped, she asked, and I could hear how much it cost her to ask if I might be willing to help with the down payment. The house they were looking at was listed at $410,000. They needed $62,000 for 20% down. I told her I would think about it. I did think about it. For 2 weeks I turned it over in my mind. I had the money. Merit Construction was doing well. I had retirement accounts, savings, equity in my own home. $62,000 would not break me. And Renee was my daughter. Oliver was my grandson. I wanted them to have stability. What I did not want was to hand that money to Derek. But I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself a father helps his children. I told myself that Patricia would have wanted me to do this. I gave them the money. I did not ask for paperwork. I did not consult a lawyer. I wrote the check and handed it to Renee on a Sunday afternoon, and she hugged me and cried a little, and Derek shook my hand and said thanks. Walt. And that was the end of it. They moved in 6 weeks later. A 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street in Westerville. Good school district. Big backyard. The kind of house I would have worked 10 years to afford at their age. For about a year, things were decent. I visited often. I helped with small repairs around the house. A bathroom, faucet, some trim work. A fence panel that had rotted. Derek accepted the help without gratitude. In the way you accept help from someone you consider beneath you. I noticed I kept my mouth shut. Then Renee got pregnant again. The second baby was a girl. They named her Grace. She was born healthy and small. 6 pounds even. With Renee's eyes. Oliver was 2.5 and spent the first week asking to hold his sister every 10 minutes. I felt that expansion in my chest again. That specific fullness that grandchildren bring. But something was shifting in the house. After Grace was born, Renee stopped working. They agreed she would stay home for a year. Derek's income covered the mortgage and basic expenses, but left little room. I started getting calls. Could I help with the car payment this month? Derek's truck needed new tires. Oliver needed new shoes. The pediatrician recommended orthodontic evaluation. Could I send something toward that? I helped every time. I did not keep a running total at first. I just helped because they were family, and Renee was stretched thin, and Oliver was my grandson, and I loved them. But by the time Grace was 8 months old, I had given an additional $43,000 across those calls. I kept a notebook. I started writing it down after the third request. Not out of resentment, but because I am a man who ran a business for decades and I cannot help tracking numbers. I did not show anyone the notebook. I just kept it. Then one Sunday, Derek pulled me aside after dinner. Oliver was watching cartoons. Renee was upstairs, putting Grace down. Derek leaned against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed and told me, in a tone I had never heard from him before, flat, direct, like he was talking to a subordinate, that they were thinking about expanding the house, adding a sunroom. He wanted to know if I would cover it. I asked how much. He said probably around $35,000. I looked at him for a moment. I asked why he was asking me instead of going to the bank. He said the bank would raise their rate and they were already stretched. He said I had the money and it was just sitting there. He said, and this is the part I have not forgotten. He said that with what I had, this should not even be a question. I told him I would think about it. I drove home that night with something cold sitting in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something more like clarity. The kind that comes when you have been telling yourself a comfortable story for too long and suddenly you cannot make yourself believe it anymore. I started paying closer attention. I hired a man named Gary Trout. He was a private investigator I had used once years ago when a subcontractor was billing for work I suspected he had not done. Gary was quiet, methodical, did not ask unnecessary questions. I told him I needed to know what my son-in-law's finances actually looked like, not to cause trouble, to understand what I was dealing with. What Gary found over the next 3 months changed the shape of everything. Derek had a second credit card Renee did not know about. The balance was $22,000. The charges were restaurants, hotel rooms in downtown Columbus, a jewelry store purchase for $800, 2 weekend charges at a resort in Nashville. None of these lined up with trips Renee had mentioned. Some of them occurred on weekends when Derek had told her he was at work conferences. There was also a Venmo account. Gary could not see all of it, but he could see enough. Payments to a name I did not recognize. Consistent. Monthly. Going back 19 months. I sat with that information for a long time. I did not tell Renee. I know people will question that, but I needed to understand the full picture before I moved. Because if I moved too early, Derek would know I was watching and he would adjust. I had run a business long enough to know that when you find a problem, you do not kick it immediately. You trace it to the source first. While Gary continued gathering information, I started doing something I should have done 3 years earlier. I talked to my accountant and then I talked to an attorney. I laid out the entire history, the down payment, the additional transfers, the requests, all of it. My attorney, a woman named Sandra Cho, who specializes in family law and asset protection, listened to all of it without expression, and then told me several things that made me feel like the floor had shifted. First, the money I had given was almost certainly legally considered gifts. I had no paperwork. I had no promissory notes. I had no loan agreements. If I ever wanted to claim any of it back, I would have significant difficulty. Second, the house, the one I had funded the down payment for, was in both Renee's and Derek's names equally. If their marriage dissolved, Derek would have a claim to 50% of its value, including appreciation. Third, Sandra told me quietly that given the pattern of requests, the nature of Derek's attitude as I described it, and what I had found with Gary, I should assume this was not accidental. She said some people are very good at identifying individuals who will keep giving and structuring their behavior accordingly. I drove home from Sandra's office, and I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes. Then I got to work. The first thing I did was stop responding to money requests. Renee called in early November, asking if I could help with the heating bill. I told her I was in a tight spot with a job that had gone over budget. That was not true. But I needed to create distance quietly before I created it loudly. Derek called me 3 weeks later. First time he had ever called me directly. Not through Renee. His voice was friendly in an effortful way. He asked how I was doing. Made small talk for 90 seconds. Then mentioned that they had found a sunroom contractor, and the quote had come in at $31,000. Actually a bit less than expected. So really, now was a good time if I wanted to move on that. I told him I was not going to be able to help with that. There was a pause. He asked, why not? I said I was reassessing some things financially, and I needed to be more careful going forward. Another pause. Longer. He said, and I remember every word, Walter. You have more money than you need. This family has given you grandchildren. The least you can do is support us properly. The least you can do. I said I understood his perspective, and I would be in touch. Then I ended the call. That night, I started the next phase of what Sandra and I had been planning. I had already begun quietly restructuring. My personal savings had been moved into accounts. Derek had no visibility into accounts he had never known existed because I had never told anyone about them. The money I kept in the bank account Renee knew about. The one I had used for transfers. I reduced to a modest balance. On paper, to anyone looking at what they thought they knew, I appeared to have significantly less than I did. Sandra had also advised me on something else. She said that if I wanted to protect my estate long term, I should consider updating my will and trust structure to remove any broad language that could be interpreted as ongoing financial obligation to family members. I did that. I also amended the trust to ensure that the money I had given Renee for the down payment was formally documented retroactively. Through a letter of intent, I filed with Sandra as a conditional gift that was part of Renee's inheritance advance. Not Derek's. This would not get my money back, but it created a legal record that could matter later. I also did one more thing. I had a conversation with Renee. I asked her to meet me for lunch. Just the two of us. We went to a diner we used to go to when she was in high school. A place with red vinyl booths and good coffee. She looked tired. She had been looking tired for a long time. I asked her how she was really doing. Not as small talk. I sat across from her, and I asked her like I actually needed to know. She held it together for about 4 minutes. Then she started crying. She told me things had been hard. She told me Derek was stressed, and that stress made him difficult to be around. She told me she felt like she was managing everything, the kids, the house, the finances, the emotional temperature of every room while he worked and came home and disappeared into his phone. She told me she was not sure what she had thought marriage was going to look like, but it was not this. I did not tell her what Gary had found. Not yet. But I took her hand across the table and I told her that no matter what happened, no matter what she decided about her life, Oliver and Grace, and she would always have a place to land. I told her my door was open. I told her she did not have to protect me from the truth about her marriage. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded slowly, like something inside her was deciding something. 2 weeks later she called me. Her voice was different, quieter, more careful. She said she had found something on Derek's phone. She did not say what. She just said she needed a few days to think. I told her I was here. I waited. She called back 4 days later and said she had spoken to a lawyer. I told her I knew a good one. What happened over the next 6 weeks was difficult in the way that necessary things are sometimes difficult. Renee filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning. Derek came home that evening to find that she had already spoken to a family attorney, that the locks had not been changed. Sandra advised against that, but that there was a separation agreement being drafted, and she had documentation. He called me that night. Not René. Me. His voice had lost the flatness it usually carried. He was loud. Accusatory. He said I had poisoned his marriage. He said I had turned his wife against him. He said he knew I had never liked him, and this was my way of controlling Renee. He said he would make sure I never saw Oliver and Grace again. I let him talk. When he was finished, I told him, calmly, that I had not made any decision for Renee. I told him Renee was a grown woman who had made her own discovery and her own choice. I told him I hoped he would conduct himself with dignity for the sake of his children. Then I told him that Sandra Cho had compiled a detailed financial file that would be made available to Renee's legal team and, if necessary, to the court. I told him the file included records of accounts, charges, and transfers going back 22 months. I told him that if he pursued any action that would limit my access to my grandchildren, that file would become relevant very quickly. He hung up. The divorce took 7 months. Derek hired a decent attorney. He pushed on the house equity, on asset division, on the classification of my down payment contribution. Sandra's documentation held the letter of intent, the formalized record of the gift as an advance on Renee's inheritance, was accepted as part of the proceeding. Derek left the marriage with his personal assets, his retirement account, and an obligation for child support. The house stayed with Renee. She kept 50% of what had appreciated. He did not get $1 of what I had built. I will be honest about something. There were moments in those 7 months when I second-guessed myself, when I sat in my own house at night and wondered if I had done the right things in the right order. I thought about Renee crying at the diner table. I thought about Oliver, who was 4 years old and could not understand why his father did not live with him anymore. I thought about Grace, who was not old enough to understand anything, but who would grow up with parents in 2 houses. I did not feel triumphant. I felt like a man who had done what needed to be done and was carrying the weight of that. But I also thought about Patricia. I thought about what she would have said. And I think she would have said that protecting your children sometimes means protecting them from decisions they cannot see clearly yet. I think she would have said that the notebook I kept was not pettiness. It was responsibility. I think she would have told me I did right. Oliver still calls me Pop. He is 5 now, and he spent last Friday at my house the same way he has spent every Friday for as long as he can remember. We built a birdhouse. His hands are getting big enough to hold the smaller tools, and he is very serious about measuring things correctly, which makes me smile every time. Grace is 2.5, and has recently decided that she would like to carry everything I own from one room to another, for reasons only she understands. I follow her around my house, watching her rearrange my life, and I feel something that I do not have a precise word for. Full. Something like full. Renee is doing better. She went back to work 3 months after the divorce was finalized. She is quieter than she used to be. More careful. But there is something solid in her now that I do not remember seeing before. She has started keeping her own garden. Small. In the backyard. Just a few raised beds. She calls me sometimes to ask about plants. What needs full sun? When to start seeds indoors? She does not sound like a woman managing a temperature anymore. She sounds like herself. Last month, she said something to me at Sunday dinner that I keep coming back to. She was washing dishes and I was drying, and she said, without looking up, that she was sorry it had taken her so long to see clearly. She said she thought she had been afraid that if she looked too hard at the truth, it would cost her too much. She said she did not realize that not looking was costing her more. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said that the important thing was that she was looking now. She nodded. Kept washing. I kept drying. There is something I want to say to anyone listening to this who might be in a position I was in, not as someone who has all the answers, as someone who made mistakes and then tried to stop making them. Do not confuse generosity with obligation. They are not the same thing. Generosity is a choice you make freely because you love someone. Obligation is what someone else decides. You owe them. The moment someone tells you that your resources exist to serve their plans, that your love is expressed by your compliance, that your worth to the family is measured in what you transfer. That is not a family relationship anymore. That is something else. And you are allowed to name it, document everything. Not because you plan to use it as a weapon, because clarity matters. Because when the story gets complicated, you need to be able to return to facts. Talk to a lawyer before you write a check. And do not wait until the damage is complete to decide you deserve better. You deserve better now. While there is still time to change the shape of things, I am 67 years old. I still wake up early. The habit does not leave you. I make coffee before sunrise, and I sit at my kitchen table, and some mornings I look out the window at the play set I built in the backyard, the one Oliver climbs on every Friday. The one Grace has recently started, trying to scale one rung at a time, and I think about the 40 years of early mornings that made that play set possible. The concrete I poured at 22, the first job I ran on my own, the company I built and the men who worked for me, and the morning Patricia told me she was pregnant with Renee, and I stood in our first kitchen not knowing what to do with the size of what I felt. None of that was wasted. None of it went where Derek thought it was going. It went exactly where I intended it to go. And on the mornings when I sit there watching the light come up over my backyard, coffee in hand, play set in the yard, with the sound of my own heartbeat steady and unhurried in my chest, on those mornings, I feel like a man who held on to what mattered. That is enough. That is more than enough.